I mean, there's a lot of great things about a small church. You have the audacity to dream.
If our lives are looking like sacrifice, looking like giving up what we have, I think we should just start calling that a blessing.
And that's what justice calls for, the restoration of the individual, of the communal and societal, and the structural.
Welcome to Parish, a video podcast that celebrates, equips, and focuses on small churches and why they matter so much. We believe small churches are uniquely positioned to integrate in their communities and engage issues in ways only small churches can. I'm your host, Kanan Hurst, and this is episode 6, Kingdom Justice, Part 1.
Today, I am so excited to have you,
Thank
Michelle.
you.
We have Michelle Warren, who's, I feel like you've lived 30 lifetimes of work. You are an activist, you're an advocate, you're an educator. You've led and planted small churches. You're still a part of a small church. You've been in the offices of some of the highest ranking members of Congress on Capitol Hill. But more importantly, you've been boots on the ground with the marginalized and the oppressed. I mean, I could go on and on and on. You are also an author of 2 amazing books.
Thank you.
Read both of them. The Power of Proximity, which is amazing. If you're listening and haven't heard of it or read it, please do, because it's about being proximate to the poor and the marginalized, finding out the needs of your community and just listening to them instead of, I feel like that's what I gleaned. Like, don't come in trying to say, here's what you need.
That's good.
Listen to the needs of the people around you and be present with those in need around you. And then Join the Resistance is your brand new book. Step into the good work of kingdom justice. We're going to talk a lot more about that later on, but I just want to start by kind of talking about who you are and how you got to the place of advocacy and activism, and why you care so much about small churches.
Well, thank you, Kanan, for having me. And I have to laugh when you said, like multiple lives. What happens when you get older is you can do a lot of stuff. So I'm not young anymore. I've had a lot of beautiful 30 years of a career, and it really is just more like a life's work and calling. And so I'm just grateful. And you're right, there's been a lot that I've been able to participate in. I do want to say congratulations on reading that second book. It hasn't even come out yet. There's only like a tiny group of people who have an advanced copy. That's amazing.
I have to admit, last night I was reading way late into the night because I couldn't put it down.
Oh, wow. That's
and so
great.
as of the time of this filming, it's not out, but when it
Sure.
gets released, and we'll put the link in the show notes.
Buy the book.
Buy the book. It is so worth it. I couldn't put
I'm
it down.
glad. Oh, that's exciting. Yeah, I can't wait for people to read it and hear their response. You take all of these ideas, and they didn't just they weren't birthed overnight, and you bring them from your head and your heart out on paper, and then you wait through all the editing process. It's like, okay, now it's going to be hitting the hearts and minds of people, and you wonder how it's going to impact them. So thanks. That's really encouraging to hear.
Absolutely. So yeah, how did you get here? Why do you care so much about this?
Yeah. So thank you for the opportunity to even think about that. I didn't really mean to do any of what I've been doing these last 30 years. I sort of continued to wake up wanting to have a life of service and a life of substance. I'm not just this independent person. I'm the daughter of someone, and I'm now, I married young, and so I was the wife, and I had kids a little young, and so I was a mother. And so there's a lot of things I had to think about leaning into. But in addition to all of those pieces and all of the expectations of waking up as a daughter, and I'm the oldest too, by the way. And so my dad had a lot of really good ideas of what I should be doing. And I remember when I told him what I was going to do, and it was hard. It was really hard. And my parents have been wonderfully supportive. But I think one of the monikers I would probably use the most that's overarching that would answer why were you a teacher? Why did you plant small churches? Why are you an activist and an advocate and an author? It's just, I really care about being a neighbor. And that comes from being a Christian. It seems so small and simple, but it's true. I mean, I love Jesus. I love Jesus. And to love Jesus means that you have a heart for your neighbor, you love justice, and you sign up for the work of resistance. And we can unpack that a little bit more. But yeah, just wanting to follow Christ. I know from a young age that I had a heart for reconciliation. I didn't know any of those words. But, as you get older, you can reflect back. And I was thinking about this one story. I grew up in the 70s, and in the church, that was more of a fundamentalism than it was an evangelicalism. And there's a lot of problems with fundamentalism and evangelicalism. But one of the things that I'm really grateful was just this habitual desire and practice of going to the Bible and really finding comfort from the words, trying to understand sort of that light for the path. And I remember when I was in high school, I read John 17, which is where Jesus is in the garden with God, and right before he's going to be tried and crucified. And all he is doing is praying and begging that God would, that we would be one, that the people would be one, just like he and the Father are one, and not have different agendas and ideas, but really work towards the care, the concern, the restoration, the justice of God in his heart. And so, like I said, I was living in a homogenous, guarded community, gated community, going to private schools. I lived a very privileged life, just weeping over the fact that there was division. And I think God gave that to me as a gift, and then began to open my eyes to the extreme amount of division, not just in his church, but in humanity.
Yeah, absolutely. um, and then you got to Denver and...
Sure. Okay. So let me just say this. My dad wanted me to be an engineer.
Okay.
He wanted me to be an engineer. He's got his PhD in nuclear engineering. He's like, she's so smart. She's so capable. Every parent thinks that. I don't know if I could have done it. But the point was, I was trying to make him happy. So I was like, I'm going to get a math degree. That will keep him at bay.
Yeah.
Then I decided to teach. And I was in Dallas. And I lived in a Section 8 apartments, all African-American community, taught at the local middle schools. And I think when you're young and you tell your parents stuff, it's like, oh, that's very nice.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's a phase that they're going to, she's
A lot
going to
of
go through.
condescension. Yeah.
We're just like, okay, we'll just let her have some fun. She didn't go to the Peace Corps. She decided to go to Interstate Dallas. So I had done that for a few years. And David and I married right out of college. And David and I knew that we were going to live in a community, work in a community, worship in a community. And it was going to be defined by communities that were impacted by economic and racial injustice. Now, we didn't have that language, but that's really what it was about. So when we moved up here to Denver, I had already been kind of living out some of those desires for a few years. And we're like, okay, well, now let's go ahead and join this church, Open Door Fellowship, which is historically, we've always called ourselves like a homeless church or a mission trying to be a church. So a rescue mission is just a different type of outreach ministry.
Yeah.
And Open Door Fellowship was kind of like this mission trying to be a church, trying to be the body of Christ, trying to make sure that we were cradle to grave. We're not programs, everybody can come and everybody can work together to not only find Christ individually, but collectively and care about our community. So anyway, so we come to this community, very radical in the 90s, and start a home for homeless teen girls right off of Colfax. We had a 6-week-old baby. And so that is when like the ante started getting upped. It's like, okay, this isn't a phase of these two crazy young people. Now they got a baby. What are you thinking? And there wasn't like this separate apartment. There was no organization. We're just like, yeah, this is what we're going to do. We're going to live with, teens right off the street and really work together towards restoration. Every experience I had, even in those years, whether it was volunteering through college, the years of teaching, living in the community, starting at home, if I had never done anything more, my whole life would have been completely changed as a result. And sometimes God asks us to do things for short periods of time.
Sure.
Sometimes we were like, God, this isn't Jonah here, but I can't, and that's okay. There's seasons that we do things. I think the gift and the grace for me is that I got to stay. And so the next year, David, myself, and a couple other crazy people started Open Door Ministries, which was going to be this organization that provided stability to the house that we started, another house that was there, and then the dreams and the plans of this tiny little church off of Colfax. And if you don't know my husband, I don't know if you know David. Dave and I are, in some ways, people are like, how are the two of you married? Because we seem so different. And we're not that different, but we have very different gifting. And David, I feel like I'm married up. He would probably tell you just the opposite, but I'm married up because he can land visions like nobody's business. And when I say landed, I mean deep roots, stabilization, isn't going to go anywhere. Yeah. And even as a young age, that was his gifting. That's his gift to the body of Christ. So we came up here and started that home, then started Open Door Ministries, and then we were just doing whatever we could. Open Door Ministries is a community development corporation that was the dream of the Church Open Door Fellowship. When you're a tiny church, and that's kind of what this podcast is about, you can have lots of dreams, but you don't have the same resources. And so you have imposter syndrome, right? Of the big churches. Oh, if I only could have, right? Yeah. So you have not the same amount of resources. And then for us, we did not have, well, first of all, we were a homeless church. So we had even fewer resources.
Right.
But one of the really good things about there's a lot of great things about a small church, is you have the audacity to dream. Everything is based on dreams and an idea. It's held together with duct tape. You have to do it for free. Everybody's hustling together. And if you didn't show up, it wouldn't be there.
Right.
But that's also the beauty, is you're not waiting to get this certain kind of funding, and you're not waiting for the right position to be filled with the right person. You're like, what do we want to do together for Jesus? What do we want to do for his kingdom? And in our community, where I was living and working and worshiping, gentrification had just begun to become a tsunami. I use that word intentionally because a tsunami, if you see it, it's too late.
Yeah.
And so in our community, we began to see this tsunami of gentrification. And so people were being displaced faster than you can imagine, and so much of where you place yourself is how communities are able to be built. And when you don't have money, you scatter. And so anyway, just that early decade or so was fantastic for innovation. When you don't got stuff, you are innovative. Yeah. So really, honestly, a bunch of us should just call ourselves innovators.
Absolutely. Yeah. Like the lack of monetary resources does not mean the inability to make it work. Right. And that's what I think a lot of folks have been trained to think, well, if we can't just be financially stable, then
maybe God's not in it.
Yeah,
I got stories, because even when God's in it, like you think, oh, I found this amazing ministry, and we're going to buy this, and we're going to do this, and and God brought in, and then the next day you get sued, and you're in a lawsuit for 7 years by neighbors who don't want you. It's like, is God in the? Yes, right. God continues to be in his work, because he never was not a part of it. The question is, are we in it with him?
Mm-hmm. And sitting in a space, holding space for the marginalized where you were living. I know just reading your books that was transformative and life-changing for you, to just learn from them, which developed a heart for these people. Not only that, but you got to see, I think, the biblical examples of justice, or at least the need for justice played out where you are. So let's talk about justice. Let's talk about that word, because a lot of people have a lot of different thoughts about what that means. It's unfortunately loaded, and people even think, well, the criminal justice system, that the way that even that runs is so contrary to how it's defined in biblical terms. So what is justice, especially in the church?
Yeah, so I did not arrive on the scene of working alongside and worshiping and living alongside beautiful neighbors and friends who were impacted by economic and racial injustice with language. But I told you in the beginning that I just had a heart for God and his word, and there's a lot there. And I will at least back up to just say, you can't fix problems you don't understand.
Yeah.
And living alongside people who were experiencing things that I did not understand helped me become a student, not of an issue, but of a holistic, the person. And I think that's really, really important because, first of all, I want to talk about justice. And I want to talk about kingdom justice and biblical justice because that is really the root of all justice. But I also want to talk about the holistic piece of justice. Okay. So I can't even believe that in 2022, I have to sit here and have a conversation about justice possibly not being a good word for the church. I mean, like, really,
Seriously,
I have so much grief that I could probably hit pause right now and sit in a corner and weep.
Yeah.
To know the heart of God is to know and understand his justice. I don't remember where I read it or heard it, but it was very, very early in my journey of this very radical, beautiful life and calling that I read that justice is to the Old Testament as love is to the New Testament. I've read the Bible from cover to cover many, many times over. Because remember, I started as a fundamentalist, so I'm super good at that. I mean, I would say that I was very good at church, which meant I knew how to love God, love neighbors, and be a good Pharisee. Yep, I got it.
I was just going to say, in your new book, you say, I was trained to be a good Pharisee.
I was trained to be a good Pharisee. And I'm telling you, there's probably some good things that came out of being a Pharisee.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
there were some really horrible things, being rich in spirit and all. But I will say, so reading, God's word cover to cover, I still spent I was also a Christian school kid. So let me just say, I was in church and learning from the Bible Monday through Friday, as well as Wednesday night, Sunday morning, because I'm a little older, right? Sunday morning, Sunday night. We knew how to do church.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I was a good student, good Enneagram 1. Like, man, I showed up. I was one of those kids who are like, nobody else did their homework, but I'm super cool. So I don't want to tell anybody that they didn't do it, but that really irks me.
Right.
So anyway, yes, conflicted. All to say that I didn't hear very much about the Old Testament. I heard the creation story because we got to defend that, right?
Right.
24 hours or whatever, and I heard a lot of the Psalms. I mean, there's a lot of comfort in the Psalms. And as there's a melancholy artist in me, so I loved the book of Ecclesiastes and Lamentations, but to really understand the law past the 10 Commandments and to really understand the purpose of the prophets besides the foretelling of future, I didn't spend that much time in the Old Testament because my leaders and my, mentors were not doing that. And what is so sad about that is that we miss so much of the heart of God, and then we also miss the fulfillment of how love and Jesus' satisfying of the brokenness is seen in the New Testament in that beautiful story. So anyway, to know the heart of God is to know justice. There's a Hebrew word, if you're not a theologian, mishpat. And mishpat is the Hebrew word for justice. In America and in, kind of present day, when we think of the word justice, or at least when I was growing up, it was, we're going to get justice in the courts. And it all had to do with this retribution and this punishment. And there's a piece of that. There is definitely a piece of that. But justice is, I love this illustration of, if you can imagine sort of maybe a clock with a pendulum, or even just a pendulum swinging, that justice isn't a fixed concept.
Yeah.
It's not just punishment, that it moves gently back and forth between opportunities and punishment to restore. Yeah. If you think about training animals, you could think about training anybody. I mean, it's so basic. I give you rewards for doing good. I give you punishment for doing bad. I'm not sure as a parent what to do here. I'm not sure as a teacher. I'm not sure as in society. I'm not sure as a judge. What is going to incentivize you? What's going to restore you?
Yeah.
So that is the concept of justice, is this balance of, how do I restore a person? The thing is that the justice of God is not just looking at the restoration of individuals. Often in our current context, we think about that, but in like, this person needs to be restored, and that's important. And in the Bible, we are responsible for us as individuals. I think it's a very American mindset of individuality, or I would say a white mindset, American mindset of individuality. And there is responsibility for individuals. There is no doubt. But the concept of community, which is also an incredibly biblical concept of the family of God and the community, you see it being set up in the Old Testament. Through the law, it isn't just about individual behavior, opportunities, and consequences. It's always looking at how do we restore the whole? How do we protect the whole? The beginning of, Israel, you have all of these, you have 13 different pieces of land, because Joseph is got two, Esau and Manasseh, right? So you've got these lands and then you've got all these laws. Like everybody was just given opportunities. The Levites didn't get property, so maybe my math is off a little bit. I do have a degree in math, but whatever. Can't add and subtract this morning. Anyway, just to say that everyone was given this. Was your right. This was your opportunity to subdue, to be able to flourish. You've endured a lot for many, many generations. You're finally in this place. And every 7 years, I want you to rest. And every 50 years, despite what happens, the just thing is to be restored in Jubilee, where everybody goes back. Because things happen. People get sick, bugs, destroy crops. I mean, I don't really want to go into all the different metaphors, but things happen. Yeah. And justice acknowledges that not everybody's individual or collective. You can't control a hurricane. Right. That there's times that things are going to happen that God allows and permits. And we as a society need to have this heart for restoring, repairing, restoration. So that's just sort of the Levitical kind of overview of whether it's good or bad. But this concept of restoration is really the setup that God gave us in Genesis 3. In 1 and 2, where he 6 times says things are good. It's good, this is good, this is good. The last time it is actually very good, which is in the Hebrew is forceful or vehemently good, like that. And good wasn't like, oh, this is a good cup of coffee. By the way, Kanan, thank you for my coffee. This is about everything works. It's whole. The reason this is important is because it's the hinge of justice and the heart of God. So if you can think about how maybe systems and, you got your bike gears, or maybe you've put something together and it's like, oh, thank God, it finally works. That's what that word good means. Oh, it works together. It flows. Okay, so God was like doing solar systems and planets. Like, this is good. This works together. This isn't a disparate, I made this and I made this, I made that. It's like all connected.
Right.
And in this connection, then the connection breaks. And that's what sin did, is it broke everything. And the whole idea of the heart of God is to bring it all back together.
Right.
The gospel's justice.
Yeah. The restoration.
The restoration.
Yeah.
Of the individual, of the whole. And as I was sharing, holistic. We learn in the New Testament that Christ is not doing a small work. That he's not going to give up on the work that he started, and that he is working to restore all things. And I think we have to ask ourselves, what is the all in all things?
Yeah.
I feel like we finally understand, okay, so it's the spiritual, the mental, the physical, the emotional, but we still see it as individual. But I want us to keep remembering, and that's what justice calls for, the restoration of the individual, of the communal and societal, and the structural.
That's such a good point, because this idea of collective responsibility that you see all throughout the Old Testament, the New Testament, things that it is lost on the Western white church for a lot of reasons, right? Because it's a lot easier to just say, well, I didn't create the criminal punishment system, you could call it. I've heard Christians, well-meaning Christians, right, white Christians say, well, we just, it's all about evangelism. If we just change people's hearts. And that's attempting, it's kind of true on one level, but I became a believer way before I realized and recognized the inequities that existed structurally, institutionally in this country. My heart was changed on a level of being restored in relationship to God, but it wasn't, I wasn't aware of these issues. And so, we can't use that as an excuse, right? I've heard people say, it's not the church's job to fix all the problems in the world. I mean, I just heard that on a podcast.
Which podcast and who are they? How can I find them?
Exactly. No, and it's such a reformed kind of Western way to think. Well, the church is just supposed to be set apart and different, and kind of a view of wholeness that is set apart from the rest of the world, right? And it's always privileged, usually male, white people who are saying that, because. And I want to get into kind of the status quo argument that you make in your book. If the status quo is comfortable for you, if you're not faced with problems based on it, then the whole system is built to work for you, and it doesn't work for other people, right? So in your book, when I was enjoying the resistance, as I was reading, I was just thinking. I think a huge theme is leverage your privilege for the sake of the oppressed and the poor and the marginalized, which is so good. And I think your book is one of the best ways for privileged folks to do that, is just to read, like, you're leveraging what what you've learned. Because I felt like it was really here's what advocating for justice, if you don't have to on a daily basis, looks like, And so let's talk about that. Just kind of this idea of individualism, but also like what is advocating to kind of change the status quo look like?
We could probably take about 6 hours to unpack what you just shared, because I was like, oh my goodness, Kanan, we need to get together more. I think I'm still struck with, if it's not the church's responsibility, then whose is it?
Yeah.
Jesus said, you are the light of the world. He said, I'm the light of the world. And then he says, you too are the light of the world. Yeah. And then backs it up by saying, only a fool would put it under a bowl. And so this idea that I see the evil, but I close my eyes. I hear the cries of evil, but I close my ears. I, hear people talking about evil, but I close my mouth.
Yeah.
I don't see anything in Scripture, nothing, which is why I highlight the prophets and Jesus' parables. I mean, Jesus was so subversive. What are you going to do when you're dealing with leaders who are rich in spirit? That's what it is to be rich in spirit. Sometimes we don't understand what poor in spirit is, but if we put the contrast, do my little math thing, rich in spirit means I got the answers. I know what I'm supposed to be doing. I show up ready. And not only do I show up ready, but I'm ready to fight about it. Okay, I don't want anything to do with that.
Yeah.
But to be poor in spirit and to recognize that Christ commissioned us to be light in the world. Why would we need to be light if there wasn't darkness? Right. Why would he even say that? Yeah. So I also want to point out 3 really important parables to just really push back on the role of the church. So, if you go into Matthew, Jesus is actually talking about the end times. You're kind of gearing up, Matthew 23, 24, 25. He's like, someday this is coming.
Right.
And then he gives you 3 parables. He gives you the parable of the virgins. You got 10 virgins, keep your oil. The bridegroom's coming. 5 are ready, 5 aren't. And I think that we probably stop there, that parable. Right? But it's an important parable. Like, I better make sure I have my oil. Jesus is coming back. You're absolutely right. But if you don't continue to move into the next one, which is the parable of the talents, just like, well, why are you even, what are you doing while you wait for the bridegroom? Because the next thing is that rich master, I'm leaving, but I'm coming back. Mm-hmm. And that's Jesus. I'm coming back. I'm going to give you this. I'm going to give you this. I'm going to give you this. What are you going to do with it? And you'll have to read my book to show how much I think rich Christians only have one talent. They're not very rich in the world. They're rich in the world, but they are not rich in the kingdom.
Yeah.
And I really don't believe that parable, now I'm guessing, but I don't think that parable, and that's the way I was taught, like, well, I'm wealthy and I have education, and there is responsibility with that. But that is to make me more dependent on myself and less dependent on God, which would be, why wouldn't I hide from the darkness? I'm self-sufficient by myself. Yeah. So anyway, that second parable really says you better invest. And you need to evaluate what God has given to you, and you need to stop being afraid. And one of the reasons Dark is scary. Darkness is scary. It's scary for a child who's learning to overcome their fear of darkness. When God continues to open up our eyes, that's what I'm talking about, that see, no, that's what peacemaking is. I will see, I will hear, and I will speak, but I will trust that the darkness is not going to overcome me. I will not be overcome by evil. I will overcome it with the light of Christ, and I will overcome it with good. Right? That is this belief that I don't have to bury my talent. I don't have to be afraid. I don't have to worry. I have been given everything I need to impact darkness, which means I need to run to it.
Yeah.
I'm commanded to live in the world, not escape from the world. And I feel like, of course, growing up is fundamentals, but I don't see it big and different anymore. I think now we just do things like drink and dance. I don't see this radical Christian living of freedom and this recognition that God is so sufficient, that we still are creating our Christian comfort zones and hanging out in basements with our canned goods and our flashlights, waiting for the darkness to pass.
Right.
And maybe Jesus will come back. And I do think he's going to come back, even if we are embarrassing and burying ourselves in that Christian bubble basement. Okay. And then that third one, that third parable is the sheep and the goats. And that is, how are you spending your time? Who are you investing in? And Jesus says, if you're not investing in the poor, the imprisoned, the stranger, the immigrant, I don't even know you.
Yeah.
Depart from me.
Yeah. This is my very character.
Is my very character. And if you miss seeing me here on earth, I don't know why we would want to spend eternity with each other. Now, I'm not going to get into the theology of the salvific work of Jesus and works. I really am not going to, but I do think it is a scathing set of parables meant to be telling a story. I'm coming back. You need to, 1, identify with me. I'm your bridegroom. Don't miss it. 2, how are you investing? And don't think that your wealth and your privilege is of any consequence and value of me. Stop hiding and burying the very little I've even given you in the richness of the kingdom. And then the third one is, how are you investing those talents? Where are you putting your energy?
That's
I can't remember what the original question was, but I could not. I'm just so upset that the church would not think that its purpose was one of collectivism. We are told there's so much in the body of Christ. The Holy Spirit came at Pentecost to restore and repair. This was sort of the justice of God to connect relational brokenness. Yes to us, to God. But there was a lot lost in that brokenness in Genesis 3. I now know, now I'm warring with my fellow humans, who's more powerful, who's going to go up under,
right.
That restoration of people to people and people groups to people groups, that's the work of the Holy Spirit. That's the work of agents of light and salt and the restoration. Jesus is doing that work, and he invites us to join him.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the whole idea of joining the resistance.
That's discipleship, right? If we're saying we're disciples, and then we're saying make disciple, we got to redefine if our view of making disciples is getting people to call upon the name of the Lord and be justified by his blood and sacrifice and raised again. Yes, of course, that's a part of it. That's not the whole gospel. That's justification, right? If he calls, follow and obey my commandments, right? It's kind of the Dallas Willard, idea of apprenticing Jesus. Like, if we're not, the vast majority of his ministry was follow me as I show you how to live. But I think in kind of our overemphasis on intellectual, ways of growing, we just want to focus on the things that are spiritual. Yeah, that's one thing.
I want to talk to James when I get to heaven, where we're kind of towards the end of the New Testament when James comes in, and that's another thing. I just don't feel like as of the last 10, 15 years, that pure and true religion of caring for widows, orphans, widows and orphans and the poor, that has been highlighted a little bit, but show me your faith by your works. Show me your evidence that you're living out the witness and love and testament of who Christ is, not because of your intellectual knowledge, I don't really care what small group you went to and what answers you put down on your Bible study thing. Now, I do think knowing the Word of God is really important, and those are teaching tools. I'm a teacher. That is the way you get it in. But if you think that defines your spirituality, no, that is nourishment for the exercise.
Right.
We
Right.
eat so we can do. And here's the point. What happens if we eat and don't do? What happens to our bodies physically if we just ingest food and we
Yeah.
literally don't move?
We get lazy and
Huge.
huge.
That's right.
and
So I actually,
unable to move.
yeah,
and
well, I
atrophy.
really think that's what we've got in our churches. Begin to think about not exercising. And the more strenuous the exercise, one, the more desperate you are, more food, but the more effective you are to move your body. And so both individually and collectively, if we are just takers, and then do something that doesn't cost us much. I mean, if it makes you happy to look at your Fitbit and see 300 calories at the end of a day, that's fine. But when you see 3,000, you know you did the work.
Right.
I want it like some spiritual Fitbit. Like, come on, show me your faith by your works. Not because it's going to attain a righteousness, but that is your absolute purpose on this earth. Otherwise, you should have just been taken right after salvation, if that's really it.
Right.
But I want to say this, Keenan. When you have resources, when we're talking about churches, in little churches, when you have resources, you have to be innovative. When you don't have resources, you have to be innovative. When you have resources, you actually really don't need anything but an eternal destiny. You got it here.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I got insurance if my car breaks down. I got insurance if my stuff gets stolen. I got insurance. As long as I got money to pay for my insurance, I've created my own safety nets. And I think that was probably one of the biggest things that I noticed in my own life was I just was born into a world of safety nets. I took them for granted. I didn't know I had social capital. I had, this buy-in to this culture that would protect me from any type of harm. I mean, I'm not saying that bad things couldn't happen to me. And yeah, I just had to wake up every morning and maintain what I was given.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's very different than having nothing and living on survival. Let's go to justice in the New Testament. So here's an interesting thing. The word for justice is the same as the word for righteousness in the New Greek.
Yes. I
And
wanted
so,
to talk about that.
yeah, so inserting those words is really important. And it's not a full, every time you see righteousness, it's the word justice, but super majority, of the time. I remember asking a friend, like, why did the King James Version, he's much smarter than I am, and I was like, why did the King James Version decide to put the word righteousness instead of the word justice? And he's like, Michelle, I really don't know, but I guess if I was a king, I would be more worried about individual piety than having myself implicated in, are we creating a just society
Yes.
and
Well, and
system?
it's something people are talking about because you're not the first person to point that out. I think I was a little bit offended when I heard that because my whole understanding, exactly to your point about being a king, so to speak, like saying, no, I thought this meant just right, following the rules or right kind of beliefs, right believing is what I think we're conditioned to do. And I wanted to bring something up because you mentioned wealth, monetary wealth, which is kind of negative wealth in the kingdom of God. It is a resource that
We need
can
it.
be
I mean, I'd much rather
leveraged.
be rich. It'd be easier to be rich and help the poor than actually keep being poor like the poor.
But isn't it wild that the more power people get, the less willing they are to leverage their resources?
So that is key with the work of resistance. It isn't just money, but it is influence. I do a lot of work around the country, and I help strengthen the voices, community voices for systemic change. And I work in a lot of diverse settings, and this mystery of, well, if white, and this was an African-American pastor asking me in the South, he's just like, I don't understand why this person wants me as their Black friend, but won't do things to basically liberate what I'm talking about. And, for a long time, I was like, yeah, us white people, and I think that can be an easy narrative. But I began to realize, and I told him, I was just like, when you are a person of privilege and power, you sit at powerful tables and you're allowed to have a Black friend and share a little bit here and there. But the more you talk, the more you lose. And what happens is when you have a lot, you do have a farther way to fall, but you have a lot to lose. What I've kind of noticed in with me, I don't have that much to lose. Like, I don't have a lot of financial wealth. I don't work in a traditional church and organization. That's just not where I've been called to do that. I mean, I always have a lot to lose, but not really. Like, when I talk, yes, Open Door Ministries gets threatened. I mean, I got so many stories. Every time I open my mouth, some other donors like, we're taking more money away. I just think God had a heart for the immigrants. Why would you take more money away? But I do know that is kind of the way we treat our prophets. We cut off their funding when they actually speak the heart of God. But I don't have a lot to lose. And I think when you're maintaining, and maybe that's the whole point, is we're not supposed to be living our life as though we own anything and have things to lose. Because Jesus said, you're supposed to throw away your life. And if you throw away, you're actually going to find it. And maybe it's just claustrophobic to have power and claustrophobic to have privilege, because you have the risk of losing that power. And I do talk about that in my book. And it's not like it's some really great new thing here, but I think it's just another is human nature fights to survive. And even privileged people are working to stay at privileged tables. And why?
Right. Like, how much does Jesus not only talk about, but display losing, intentionally losing things for the sake of
I don't think
others.
he had a different message.
He didn't.
I really think that was it. It was like, follow me. I lost everything and come to earth, and then I was killed for what I said.
Right.
So why don't you follow me to your death?
Lay up your treasures in
right.
heaven, all of
That's
your
right.
treasures, and that's convicting to me, of course, like, even now. And I think it should always be, because our temptation, even everything that our culture is telling us, is gather, gain.
So just to tell you this, small churches don't have as much to lose, so they do the work of advocacy. I just want to put that out there. Like, I have no trouble getting small church pastors to sign stuff and show up.
Yes.
But those big church pastors, this is what they do. This is like such a segue. They meet with me. They're usually... They look so scared. I met with some of the pastors of the biggest congregations, and they have these private meetings, and they just look almost like they're going to throw up. Like, okay, I gave you this meeting. What are you going to ask me to do? I feel like I am Deborah. Like, like Barak, we're going to war. Okay, will you go with me?
Yeah, exactly.
But anyway, small churches can flex a little bit easier on the work of justice. That doesn't mean they all do, but when you have less to lose, you jump in. And I think the challenge is when you have more to lose, it's harder, but you have more to offer. People listen to big, powerful people.
Yeah. One thing kind of on that, and on the talents idea, we have, I've been thinking about this a lot. We have a really harmful knack of calling certain things blessings that aren't. Like, oh, God blessed us with an LED wall, or like, God blessed us. And I don't want to hate on big churches. That's not what this is about.
No, because little churches are trying to be big churches. I mean, like, we have to repent of that.
Right.
That's why I said that imposter syndrome. It's like, well, I want to be little and great.
Yeah.
And we still struggle with the same.
Exactly.
I wish
Let
we
us
didn't.
make a
I
name
wish
for
we
ourselves.
didn't.
I mean, that's why God... That is one of the reasons God spread out the people of Babel. Let us make a name for ourselves, because influence is everything. Influence is arguably more valuable right now than money. Money kind of helps bring that, of course. But
the amount of privilege that we give to people who have money. Like, I will make you in charge, of this, and I will just treat you as though you're smarter and better. And that could not, that's just not real.
If our lives are looking like sacrifice, looking like giving up what we have, leveraging what we have constantly for the sake of others, or trying to do that the best we can, then I think we should just start calling that a blessing. I mean, like, we love small churches.
I don't know if you read Matthew 5, but that's exactly what Jesus used was, it's blessed when you mourn. It's blessed when you're pure, pure in heart. It's blessed when you're a peacemaker. And that sounds great, but you know what a peacemaker is? A peacemaker is incredibly disruptive.
Right.
A peacemaker is committed to this is what I think, two things: truth-telling and repair. And that should be easy for people who follow Jesus, who said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life.
Right.
For people who are saying that they want to be, the truth is going to set us free. I have never watched a people who say they want to be defined by the truth be more scared of it. But you're not going to have peace unless you're honest about what's really going on. So back to that, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. That would be the shame of the people of God. And I want to say this about repair. So repair is all about justice. It's not okay if me and my family do okay if my neighbors don't. And it's this collective walking together and always keeping your eyes and your ears and everything attuned to how are people being treated in the courts, in the systems, in the community. And if you just live in a community where everybody has fairness, I'm going to challenge that too. Not because people do not have to live my life. That was actually the gift, was getting out. And it's not because I got out of a bad thing. Shoot, I would have loved to have done that too. I just, that's not the life God called me for. But I do think we need to not only open up everything to the pain and injustice of the world, but we need to take sizable amounts of time to be a part of it. So as far as like the repair and the restoration, you cannot have reconciliation, you cannot have repair, you cannot have restoration without honesty. And I honestly think that's why Jesus spent so much time telling the truth. Boy, was it painful for those religious leaders. They were diligently, in their own humanity, messing it up huge, keeping the love of God for themselves and a very small few, but they were constantly waiting for this Messiah.
Yeah.
Boy, was he bad news to them. He was good news to literally everybody else, but bad news to the rich in spirit people who thought they understood the heart of God and how to attain it. And all Jesus did was tell the truth to you and to you and to you and to you. And what an upside down, irritating, prophetic word that you would favor the sinner, that you would have a special heart and concern for the marginalized, for the woman who's caught in adultery. I mean, all he did was tell the truth.
Right.
Because there cannot be repair work. And we are so desperately in need of repair. That's the groaning that we long for. Go back to the beginning of time when everything was broken, this collective chorus of pain. We no longer work together. In John 17, God, that they would work together.
Yeah, exactly.
Like we work together. We're going to give them the Holy Spirit. We're going to give them a promise. And we're going to give them marching orders. And we're going to give them a cloud of witnesses. And they're going to be able to move together if only they would be willing to lay down everything that sells their souls.
Yeah. Gosh, what a good word. I love the idea of peacemaking. It's something we don't talk about enough. And I think for anyone listening, watching, whatever you're doing, if you've read the books, The Hunger Games, I think this is an amazing parallel. The oppressive.
I love that you bring that up because I live in District 13.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
I could have made it in the Capitol because I came from the Capitol.
Exactly. And
their pain is my sport.
Right.
That's so disgusting, but powerful.
And the police are, this kind of, especially for the marginalized, the far out, the far removed, because closer to the city are the districts that are more privileged or given more, resources, but farther and farther away, the people who keep getting pushed out, the people who are creating the food for all these people, are under oppressive kind of police state, and they call them peacekeepers. And Jesus calls us to peacemaking. And peacekeeping, I think, looks a lot more like maintaining the status quo,
No,
which
it
is
100% does.
which is what we're doing. Yeah, which is what a lot of people are doing, saying, well, no, like technically, theoretically, the system, you can work your way up.
We need to keep talking about what peacekeeping looks like because it is the shame of who we are. Like, blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are the honest people who are willing to do repair. I teach a class at Denver Seminary called Social Concerns and Community Development. And so I'm in this academic setting, really I got to be more than just like this rogue activist, and I have to actually bring, some scholar stuff, which I actually am that person as well. I just can't decide which I am, one more or the other. So I'm grateful for the opportunity. But when you look at all the social concerns in society, there's only 3 real streams that anything stems from. Now, if somebody's listening, they can find somebody else, please, reach out, because I can't find any. And one of them is poverty. The second is immigration, and the third is racism. And that's a whole podcast in itself, because racism is a social construct. Jesus didn't really talk a whole lot about that specifically. I mean, yes, around it, because it's a human problem, but it's something we created. People are going to move. People move. Immigration and migration is going to happen. So how are we as a society going to welcome, figure out, redistribute, etc.? And then poverty is real, and we need to figure out how we're going to have systems to help restore people to that productive place, be a part of that justice work. But what I have to do is teach students, and these are pastors and people in training, on community development. So how do you address social concerns through really good community development?
Right.
And so I bring this up in peacekeeping and peacemaking, because peacekeeping, sort of maintaining the status quo, I don't have to get my hands too dirty, but I can throw some solutions at the problem. So I usually talk to my students. This is about a tree. The community is a tree. A healthy tree is a healthy community. Anything that has roots has the ability to grow. And since we all were started with seeds and different placements, I mean, there's a lot to that metaphor. But when you think of this tree, what's happening under the ground, what you don't see, actually determines the health of the tree. So if we're going to be peacemakers, we need to be honest about, is everybody got access to sun? Is there access to water? What's in the soil? What's missing in the soil? What's the trauma in the soil? Like, we need to be honest. But really what I feel like the church is doing is not wanting to look at the wholeness or the whole system. They're so distressed by an unhealthy branch that they throw their crap literally at it. Here's some canned goods. Here's a little bit of money. I don't want to be honest about the roots of what's happening and how I might be or be not contributing. I'm going to just throw and adorn a sick branch and call it good.
Yeah.
So this is what peacemakers do. They do not settle for calling something good. They're honest about what's happening, and they repair it with Jesus so that it can become good again. And so that goodness, and so that when I think about my future and how do I want to invest the next whatever, I will not lie and call something that is not good, good. I will not staple fruit onto a sick tree. I will not adorn it with stuff so I don't have to see its ugly branches. I'm looking at sun, I'm looking at water, I'm looking at dirt, and I'm spending all my time in the roots. Because I will say this about racism, and I know how hard and I know how much shame there is with white people, because I'm white. And I have lived 30 years in communities of color as the token white person. And I'm telling you, I know it's painful. I know, because I'm living it. I'm still learning, and I'm still pained by that, separation and that reality. But we have to move beyond our shame. We have to move beyond our guilt to actually embrace the truth and be a part of that repair.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because moving beyond the shame and the guilt, means we have to start moving, actually physically moving, walking, integrating, instead of, there's a time for lament, but there's a lot,
Lament is exactly where you start.
And there's a huge difference between feeling shameful and lamenting, right?
Sure. Well, there's a difference between shame and guilt too.
Yeah. That's a good point. People will also use an excuse of, gosh, I know you heard it a million times in the wake of George Floyd, the people leading the movement for justice are not lining up with every single thing I believe. Okay,
that was one of the reasons I wrote the book. I'm going to, now, 5 years later, I'm going to wear a Black Lives Matter t-shirt, and I think Black Lives Matter, but I'm not associated with Black Lives Matter. I'm like, you don't have the luxury of saying that, okay? Yeah. And that's the reason I wrote, it's interesting. The framework for the book came from a social media post. So I was getting ready to march during the George Floyd protests, and I thought, well, before I go, I I'd been getting a lot of, Michelle, what are you going to say? You're not saying anything. And I'm like, I don't even know if it's my story to tell, but you're right. I do have a responsibility. I'm indigenous to white privileged evangelicals. Like I got to write things to my people, And
Right.
so I remember writing this post very, very quickly. Like it was one of those, I'm writing it on my phone, almost post rants to my people, the white ones.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I got lots of people, right?
Right.
And so I wrote this framework of you're getting ready to march. We're glad to have you. But before you even step a foot into that, you got to know some things.
Yeah.
1, you're welcome if you will serve the movement. 2, if you stay at the table. And 3, you have to help your people. And that's literally became the framework. And it's not just the framework for white people. It's actually the framework for doing the work of resistance, right? You serve the movement. You stand on the shoulders of the people who have come before you. But what I really was trying to push back on was a couple things, which is this is not your woke opportunity to perform.
Yeah.
Like, please don't be disgusting.
Yeah.
Okay. This didn't start when you become aware. This isn't your opportunity for you to shame other white people. Nobody cares. Like, just come and serve the movement. Bring your body and keep your mouth shut.
Yeah.
So that was one thing too. Rosa Parks was not your grandma.
Yeah, exactly.
And then the staying at the table, that as far as I support Black Lives Matter. I mean, I say it, but I don't support it. It's like, you obviously haven't been doing the work. Because that's not even what we're talking about down there. If you're going to serve the movement truly, you're going to come to the table and you're going to stay. That's the discipline in staying. And you're going to not parse out, well, I don't share their theology, but I do this. I don't, have this identity, but I do. Oh my goodness. Just stay at the table and do the work. And Jesus is the one who demonstrated for us a better table. He actually didn't sit there and say, okay, you poor person, I'm glad you've come here. And I just want you to know that you were caught in adultery and I'm going to let you eat at my table and I support you. I love you, sinner, but I want to make sure everybody at the table knows that I do not support the sin. Okay, this is just like, why waste words? Just stay at the table and do the work. And here's the thing is that we actually don't need your white mouth, your white body to do the work of racial injustice unless you're going to leverage your white body to do the work to help your people. Because that's the reason we don't have the vision to understand that our societies are sick. We refer to this white Christian moderate from the letters of the Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King Jr., beyond his birthday, like really get to know him a little bit more. He was just this pastor who didn't mean to become famous. He's just helping his people. He's just staying at the table. He's just serving the movement.
Boldly.
Yeah, I mean, he was actually voted by a bunch of women who were leading the movement. We obviously, there's a lot to be said. There's a reason I highlight a lot of women's stories because they're usually at the beginning of movements.
Absolutely.
But anyway.
They also were the first that it was revealed that Jesus
100%. Like you better, basically follow the women. They're the ones who don't have as much to lose.
That's a good word.
But they don't have much to lose because we haven't been given a whole lot of power anyway, even especially within the church. But Martin Luther King Jr. was just like, it's the white Christian moderate that is the hardest for me to deal with. That letter could be written today. I'm just wondering, when are we not going to be in the future letter? Like, when is it going to be, thank God, the white Christian moderate opened their mouth, didn't allow white nationalism to rule the day, didn't allow, yada, yada, yada to continue on.
That makes so much sense. There are so many white moderates now.
I have to fight being a white moderate.
Absolutely.
And here's the thing.
Absolutely.
This is so it's Martin Luther King Jr. said that at that time was like the white Christian moderate. Let's not forget that he used the word Christian moderate because he recognized our lack of involvement then and now was lack of Christian discipleship. Even Bonhoeffer recognized it, went back to Germany and said, hey, those white Christian moderates are getting it wrong. But Malcolm X, who was, secular leader, he was actually pushing back on the white liberal. They're the worst. So I really just in general, we got to get our stuff together because history's repeating ourselves. I was talking to some African-American friends in the last year or so, and they're like, white liberals are the worst. And I'm like, okay, here we go, white people. We're still the worst.
Let's talk about it because that's so important. I want to quote you from your book. This work needs people who are not trying to jockey for position or place. You go on to say, You'll have to work with people who are different from you, who have different experiences, faith traditions, or no faith at all, and racial, political, sexual, and cultural perspectives. Because Jesus did, number one.
Yeah,
And
because I live in the world.
the Pharisees, the religious experts, stayed away from those people because they weren't living perfect, wonderful lives. But Jesus said, "No, these are my people," and I'm going to go and if you want to see heart change, be present, right? I mean, he displayed that, and I'm going down another rabbit hole. But privileged, liberal, white people who because now in the world of Instagram and TikTok and everything else, like we said earlier, influence is like, at least amongst millennials and younger people, it seems to be the goal. Coming to the table, as you mentioned, you talk about the table, which is both a literal and an ideological table, which I think is beautiful. Read the book. Seriously, read the book. It's so good. We have to come with such an attitude of humility that we're not used to, right? We're used to having a voice.
White people are so worried about being labeled a racist,
Yes.
that they spend most of their time looking around. I usually try to say, racism isn't like your uncle's nasty comment. Like, they're so panicked and they're looking up and around to try to say, oh, well, that's racism and that's racist and that's racist and that's racist. And I'm like, that's exhausting work. Racism is actually not out there. It's down. Look down. Look down into the tentacles and the roots of how society is built. Right. And how you stand and flourish and how other people do not. Because if you really don't want to be a racist and you really want to do the work of overcoming racism, stop looking up and out and around, look down, because that's the lifetime work of upending the way whole societies have been written so that certain people can do well and certain people will always be kept out.
Totally. Something we've used at our church that I think has, in a lot of ways, subtly formed me was we're joining the work God's already doing in the places that we're already living, which is a humble confession. Like, I'm not capable of changing people's hearts and minds, pointing them towards Jesus. The Spirit does that work, is already doing that work. And the Spirit of God is in the mess of justice and advocacy, right? So, and achieving justice and mercy and righteousness, wholeness, shalom, is not happen on social media, and that is the easiest way for white folks to. It just feels like you have control over that. And when
it's so silly. Can I just interject about social media? Okay, first of all, I need you to know I'm a mother of sons. Okay. There's a lot I could be saying about that. All right. I mean, like, the amount of conversations that I've had about heroes and lightsabers and color. I mean, like, I feel like, wow, this is not really what I envisioned, as being a mother, but you join in.
Yeah.
Anyway, just to say this, I really don't watch football. I don't enjoy football. My family loves, my boys and my husband, like, ridiculously love football. And my daughter is the oldest. And so when she left, she was an exchange student as a 16-year-old. All of a sudden, I didn't realize how much we talked about football. I'm like, what just happened here? So in order to actually survive in my household with my then 14-year-old and 10-year-old, who are now 24 and 20 actually, I got a fantasy football team. So I play fantasy football every year. I'm a mathematician. If you look at it, I'm really good with the numbers. And I mean, it doesn't take that much to do. You don't have to know anybody's name to actually succeed. The first year I won, but that's because I think they were like 10 and 14. Now they're super good. And I work really hard not to embarrass myself every week. But I just want you to know, there's a lot of emotion. I mean, the smack talking around fantasy football and even just football in general and the players, it is a world that I am to the side of. But I just want you to know, fantasy football and being a fan and cheering literally is not anything of substance to actually playing the game. It can make you feel connected. It can get your blood boiling. You can comment all you'd like, but you are not making one lick of difference. You didn't bring that back. You're not caring for him. First of all, you did not birth that baby. You did not nurture that baby. You did not drive him to practice. You did not marry him. You did not support him. You didn't do anything. And you certainly aren't making a difference at all in the world of football to be on a fantasy league and to be commenting about it, whether it's at the sports bar or social media. That's what social media is. If you care about injustice, get off of the virtual world. I mean, if you want to tell the story about what you're actually be careful, but tell the story about what you're doing. I mean, I really struggle with social media because I'm doing a bunch of stuff and I don't want people to center me because this is, so I still haven't figured out the art of social media and how people can value what other people are doing. So I can work on that. But social media aside, that is not where the work is doing. If you want to do some work, then underneath your nails should be some dirt. Your muscles should be tired. It shouldn't just be an amygdala problem. The back of the brain that's fight and flight. That's what social media does. Like I'm just furious. And so I'm moving to the frontal lobe and I'm going to use my executive function to, be brilliant, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, literally, maybe you think you're an influencer, but that's the reason we're still stuck. Because if you could get off of social media and actually join your neighbors and you could get to know people who are impacted and begin to bridge social capital so that people who are in power see this fortified group of, I will not be content in the face of injustice. I will not accept the status quo. Mm-hmm. We have a whole different world.
Right.
Sorry, I had to just say that because first of all, I just need everybody to know I play fantasy football and it got nothing to do with any success or anything for football.
I love that. I do have to confess, like my work, my boots on the ground personally is minimal. And I'm convicted by your book, by what you're saying, by what I even talk about sometimes. So it's and the greatest thing I can do is get out of the way and be present.
Mm-hmm. It's going to stretch you too. It costs you everything. It costs you everything. I was talking to my friend and colleague, Dr. Liz Rios. She's incredible. She's out of Florida and it was her birthday, I think. And we just had a meetup. And as we were just talking, the two of us tears are just streaming down both of our faces as we felt the pain and the cost of the work. The work of justice will cost you everything. Everything. It'll cost you everything. And that's why I have to remember that everything I do is for one king and for one kingdom. And the king that I follow said it was going to cost me everything. But he promised me that if I gave up everything and I spent everything I had, I would get so much more back. Go back to that bag of the talents. If you give me everything, there's a risk in investing 5 and 10 talents, risk investing 1. You'll get it back. It's just so hard to measure. You want the success of this world and to be rich in the kingdom. And I just don't know how you can do both.
That's so good.
This is just part 1 of my conversation with Michelle Warren. Join us for episode 7, where we continue our conversation and dive even deeper into how small churches can rethink and engage in advocating for justice in their communities. Parish Podcast is a production of Vineworks Film Company. The executive producer is Nathan Hoag. This episode was produced, edited, and hosted by Kanan Hurst. Graphic design and set design by Erica Kriesel. Find us on social media at Parish Podcast. Remember to subscribe and rate this podcast wherever you listen. This video podcast has been made possible by the generous support of the Sacred Grace, an incubator and accelerator that's cultivating leaders to take spiritual and social responsibility for their neighbors and neighborhoods. For more information, visit thesacredgrace.com.